I'm often asked the question, did the Red Army like Lend Lease tanks? And the answer is probably one of those least satisfying answers you'll ever get to any question. It depends. Uh, the Red Army went through dozens of foreign vehicles between 1941 and 1945. This is a subject of entire books, and I should know I've already written two of them, and I'm definitely not going to stop here. I've had several videos on the topic, and I doubt this is my last video as well. But I just wanted to do a video overall in general, very briefly cover the major types of tanks used in the Red Army that arrived either from the US or from the UK, and put them together into one of these tier lists that all the kids are into these days. Um, Bit of a disclaimer, very frequently you hear kind of these complaints, oh, well, the Russians just want to complain about stuff. They don't want to admit that the West had any good weapons at all. They want to hog all the glory for victory, all that sort of thing. This video is based entirely on Soviet evaluations. Soviet evaluations made based on Soviet requirements. And you'll find that Soviet requirements, because of who they fought, where they fought, the crews that were in the tanks, the forces they were fighting alongside. Those were all very different from what you would find in North Africa or in Japan, in Britain's colonial possessions. No tank is going to be good, equally good everywhere. No weapon is going to be equally good everywhere. No design is going to perform equally well in 1941 and 1945. So these evaluations are based on evaluations from the Red Army, and they might disagree with evaluations made abroad. That's perfectly fine if you think that the Soviets shortchanged your favorite tank, or if you want more discussion about one specific type or another, definitely let me know in the comments below. We are going to start at the very bottom of the list with the Cruiser Tank Mark IV. The Cruiser Tank Mark IV represents a whole family of vehicles, since the British had several cruiser tanks based on the Christie type. And you might say, well, what's wrong with the Christie tanks? The USSR had BT series tanks. They were also based on actually the same Christie tank. You can tell by the wheels. So what if the British cruisers didn't have convertible drive? So what if they didn't have kind of sloped armor in the front? They still have this weird driver's cabin. They're doctrinally more or less the same as Soviet BT tanks. So what's the problem? The thing is that they are the same. They're maybe too similar. One of the weakest parts of the Christie design was the engine. Originally, Christie tanks used the Liberty engine, which was a very powerful tank engine for the time, but it was very gas hungry and it was very flammable. The USSR produced Liberty engines under the brand M5. They actually switched to improved version, the M17, which was used in BT-7 tanks, and supercharged version was used in the T-28. But even the M17 was far too fuel hungry, far too flammable to be used in tanks, and so the BT-7M, as well as the T-34, the Mk.V, etc., transitioned to V2 diesel engines. And so once the Soviets found out that there's a Liberty engine that they rejected a decade prior in a brand new British tank, they said no way. And that actually applied not just to the Cruiser Tank Mark IV, but every single British tank with a Liberty engine. If offered to the USSR, it would be rejected. And so, as I spoiled initially, the Cruiser Tank Mark IV, in fact, all British cruisers, come in at the very, very end of the list at Tier F. Next on the list is another light and fast British tank, the Light Tank Mk.VII, or the Tetrarch. The Tetrarch might appear very similar to that of the cruisers. It's a lightly armored, very fast tank, very lightly armored, actually even lighter armor than the British cruisers had, armed with the same gun. But most importantly, it did not have a Liberty engine. It had another gasoline engine, the Meadows type, but that was good enough. The Red Army decided to try their luck and order 20 of them. Upon arrival, they were actually relegated to border guard duty with Turkey and really didn't see much fighting until the Germans began to draw dangerously close to the Baku oil fields. Even then, the amount of service they saw was very limited. Unfortunately, the tank was just not suitable for the Red Army. It did not operate particularly well even in southern winters. The tracks would slip and slide on the roads, not even iced over roads, just the rain was enough. The armor was very thin. It was actually vulnerable not only to rifle fire, but it could be pried apart using a crowbar. Internal components are very vulnerable to shock, and both the proving grounds at Kubinka and individual reports from the only unit that used them came to the same conclusion: we shouldn't order any more of these tanks. And so the first 20 tanks that were ordered actually ended up being the last. But however, since the Red Army ordered a small batch of these tanks and actually used them, they get to go one step higher than the cruiser tank Mark IV at the E tier. All right, let's switch tracks for a little bit and talk about a tank that was actually successful, the infantry tank Mark II, or Matilda. The first Matilda tanks arrived in USSR towards the end of 1941, and they went into battle in quite a bit of a rush at the Battle of Moscow. I already had a video where I talked about this. The tanks performed, so-so. They were not suited for winter. You think you've all seen the photo where the Matildas flipped over and fell into a ditch because their tracks slipped on the ice. Snow would actually pack in between the side skirts and immobilize the tank. Actually, the running gear was found to be quite unreliable, where the idlers, or the return rollers, would seize up and the tracks would start grinding and quickly break down. Various internal components were found to be unreliable, but the tank, as it did in North Africa, got its reputation through its armor. The armor of the Matilda was actually on par in terms of at least line of sight thickness with the Mk.VII tank, which was a heavy tank. And even though the armament lacking high explosive ammunition was closer to that of a Soviet light tank, which used 45mm guns, the British used 40mm guns, so ballistically, armor-piercing performance was more or less the same. This tank, even though there wasn't really a niche of an infantry tank in the Red Army, the same way that the British envisioned their infantry tanks, it earned a reputation. Despite maybe some qualms about how the tanks performed in the Battle of Moscow, the overall evaluation was quite good. They were still ordered throughout 1942 and even early 1943, and fought in 1942. Hard to say that they achieved any particularly impressive results, but that wasn't really their fault. 1942 was a very positional warfare type of year, just grinding World War I style battles, and, well, the Germans weren't sitting still and did quite shore up their anti-tank armament to the point where the Matilda's armor was no longer as good as it was in 1941 and 42. Same thing happened in North Africa. The Soviets actually used their Matildas a bit longer than the British. You still had them in the front lines in the Battle of Kursk, and you still had them in the front lines in 1944, while the British really stopped using them in the front lines by 1943. The Matildas were ordered for just a bit over a year. Over 900 of these tanks came to the USSR, and I think they did pretty well. But as of 1943, really, the tank was just quite obsolete. There wasn't really a way to improve its firepower, mitigate any of its weaknesses, and so, well, it was all right. I think the Matilda comes in at an honorable C tier. Next, we have the Valentine tank. The Valentine, even though it arrived around the same time as the Matilda, and it was, well, by all measures, a lighter and smaller and, more importantly, cheaper tank than the Matilda, it was much better met in the Red Army. It was more reliable. It was, well, smaller and cheaper to operate. The diesel engines were, well, quite well liked. But most importantly, the tank had a significant reserve for modernization. The British, on their side, put in a 57mm gun, which was about a match for the Soviet Zis-2, and then a 75mm gun, although the Red Army didn't really use 75mm armed Valentines. The armor, the British didn't do much for the Valentine's armor, but actually Soviet mods to the armor were quite varied. and a number of units implemented them, even though they weren't officially approved. I can read more about that in my book, British Tanks of the Red Army. But the Valentine kind of hit all of those boxes. It was cheap. It was reasonably fast. It might actually the top speed was quite low for since it was a British infantry tank. But the average speed was still quite good because of a very favorable gear ratio. And so these tanks could generally keep up with other tanks, or well, with the infantry they were supporting anyway. In typical combat, they did evolve their armor and their firepower as they went. And, well, there were tons of them. Until 1945, the Valentine was actually the most numerous foreign tank in Red Army service. It wasn't the Sherman. Over 3,000 units of this type were sent, and, well, it was quite well liked. The shipments ended in 1944 because, well, the British themselves were not really making that many of them anymore. But Valentine tanks remained on the front lines with the Red Army until the defeat of Germany, and actually a number of them went into Manchuria to fight Japan as well. And so the Valentine, even though it was according to the British General Staff anyway, kind of a substitute, cheaper version of the Matilda, the Soviets liked it quite a bit more, and that's why it earns the honorable A tier on my tier list. The Valentine on the Eastern Front actually got an almost unique chance to prove itself in the battle for the Caucasus. Pretty much the only flow of tanks was coming in through Iran, through the southern route, which was shipping almost exclusively light tank Mk.III and Canadian Valentine tanks. And so for many units fighting to deny Germans the Baku oil fields, Valentine tanks were all they had. There were actually quite a number of units where more foreign tanks, the Mk.IIIs and the Valentines, were fighting than domestic Soviet tanks. And so, well, in these conditions, how can we deny the Valentine its rightful place as one of the best foreign tanks in service with the Red Army? Wrapping up the list of British infantry tanks, we get to the Churchill. Now, the Churchill's firepower and its armor were quite formidable for its time, but, well, reliability was not. Initial Churchill tanks performed so poorly that the British started a remanufacturing program to get rid of a large number, not all, a large number of the design defects. Even then, several hundred tanks were simply beyond fixing. They could only be retained as training units. And unfortunately, even though the tanks that went to the USSR had gone through the remanufacturing program, they still had quite a number of issues. And these were issues that, well, they delayed not just the frontline service, but testing as well. The tank initially earmarked for testing broke down, and so another Churchill had to be sent, and therefore the trials were very, very limited because the Soviets, well, the British were very honest about the mechanical issues that their tanks had, and the Soviets knew that, this tank was intended for frontline service. We can't really drive it around all that much, or else it's going to break down. Despite this very unfortunate debut, the evaluations of the tank were quite favorable. Like I said, the armor was pretty good for the time. The 57mm gun was more or less equivalent to the Soviet ZIS-2. The most important thing about the tank was the observation devices. The Mk.IV observation device that was used in Soviet tanks was actually copied from the Churchill, and, well, Mk.IV is a homage to that. It stands for Infantry Tank Mk.IV, or Churchill. The Churchill was also the only foreign tank to be given the honor of being used, at least initially, exclusively by Guards heavy tank regiments. There's some rumors out there that the Shermans were only given to Guards units. I have a video about that. That's not true, but Churchill tanks were. Churchill tanks, according to the Red Army, were fully fledged heavy tanks on par with the Mk.V and the Mk.V.I. However, as I said, the number of mechanical issues delayed the arrival of the Churchill on the front line. First Churchill tanks actually already went into battle in 1943 at the Battle of Stalingrad at the very, very tail end of it. By this point, the Germans had quite a large number of not just 88mm guns, but also high-velocity 75mm guns. So the Churchill lost its main feature, its armor. Moving forward, German armament was only getting stronger and stronger, but the Churchill's armor wasn't getting any thicker, and so all of its drawbacks, the poor reliability, the running gear that again really did not do well in the mud and the cold, all of these drawbacks were becoming more and more and more obvious. Only about 250 of these tanks were ever ordered, and well, they did not really get the opportunity to prove themselves that the Valentine or even the Matilda did. Nevertheless, this was a very powerful tank, very useful tank, and when used in favorable situations, such as actually, well, at Stalingrad, they show themselves fairly well. And so I'm going to put the Churchill a little bit higher than the Matilda at the B tier. All right, let's wrap up the British tank list with another cruiser. This is a Cromwell. Unfortunately, I don't have a model of the Cromwell with a 75mm gun, only the 95mm howitzer. But towards the end of the war, the Soviets ordered a small batch of Cromwell tanks, just 6, for testing. They had actually seen these tanks first in 1942, but the demonstration to the Soviet delegation was so bad that they actually thought that the British are doing this on purpose in order to prevent the Soviets from ordering these new tanks. Unfortunately for the British, the Cromwell was quite that bad. There's a very good reason why the first tanks that were being tested in 1942 didn't actually see battle until 1944 at Normandy. But I digress. Let's get back to the Cromwell tanks that were sent to the USSR for testing. 6 tanks arrived in Baku in August of 1944. One of them was actually put through comparative trials with a Sherman tank and a T-34-85, and the results, well, were really not in favor of the Cromwell. Famously, its main advantage is its speed, but, well, it actually turned out to be slower than the T-34-85, even in good terrain, and marginally faster than the Sherman. The very narrow tracks of the Cromwell meant that it didn't perform well at all in soft and muddy terrain. The T-34-85 and even the Sherman beat it there. And, well, as far as everything else goes, it really was not very satisfactory. The biggest complaint was the armor. I mean, you can see vertical plates held together by really big bolts. This was a downright archaic solution by 1944. The armament, the 75mm gun, was found to be inferior to the T-34-85's 85mm gun. And, well, the Sherman had the exact same 75mm gun, but the Soviets already knew about the improved 76mm. And so the Cromwell really fell behind in terms of mobility, armor, and firepower. And, well, it's hard to give it a very high score. Interestingly enough, in this case, the British also agreed. Development of a replacement for the Cromwell had actually begun in 1943, way before the Cromwell had even seen the battlefield. And that was called the Comet tank. The Comet resolved some of the Cromwell's biggest problems. It was larger, it had a more powerful gun. Some of the drawbacks of the implementation of the Christie suspension were improved. And the Comet was actually sent for testing to USSR in 1945. Unfortunately, it still had too many of the Cromwell's drawbacks, and, well, it's hard to say that it was a particularly good tank. There's a reason why the Comet had not a very exemplary post-war service, and the Centurion, Britain's other famous post-war tank, did a lot better. So I am going to have to put the Cromwell down in the E tier, and the Comet, well, let's bump it up a spot for solving at least some of the Cromwell's drawbacks and put it in the D tier. So that about wraps it up for the British. As you can see, some of their tanks are received quite well, and others not so much. Soviet evaluations of British tanks sometimes didn't really even differ from British ones. The British, for example, also had a very realistic opinion about how much a Matilda could accomplish in the battlefield. They also didn't use the Tetrarch much. They, as I just said, had a replacement in the works for the Cromwell before the Cromwell had even seen battle. In some cases, these tanks performed better in British hands, maybe because, of the theater of war that they were used in. The climate in the UK and in British colonial possessions is quite a bit milder than the climate in the USSR. And so these weaknesses weren't particularly, maybe weren't particularly as disastrous as in some cases in the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the British tanks are spread through the whole spectrum, from the absolutely worst to some of the best used in the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War.